The autumn of 1965, in Indianapolis, Indiana, presented a picturesque vision of the post-war American dream. The streets were lined with modest homes, fallen leaves gathered on the sidewalks, and the sounds of children playing echoed through the neighborhoods as evening approached. It was an era characterized by a profound sense of community trust, a time when doors were left unlocked, and neighbors believed they understood the people living next door. However, beneath this veneer of suburban tranquility, a tragic reality was unfolding at 3850 East New York Street. It was a reality that would forever shatter the illusion of neighborhood safety, redefine the boundaries of community responsibility, and permanently alter the landscape of child protection laws in the United States. This is the story of Sylvia Likens, a bright and resilient 16-year-old girl whose life was cut tragically short, not by a random act of violence, but by a prolonged, systemic failure of the adults and the community around her. To understand the circumstances that led Sylvia to that house on East New York Street, one must look at the socio-economic realities of her family. Sylvia and her younger sister, Jenny, were the daughters of Lester and Betty Likens. The Likens family lived a transient lifestyle, working on the carnival circuit. This line of work, while providing a meager income, required constant travel across the Midwest, making it incredibly difficult to provide a stable, traditional home environment for their children. In the mid-1960s, the social safety nets and childcare infrastructures that we recognize today were largely non-existent. Working-class families often had to rely on informal, undocumented arrangements to ensure their children were housed and fed while they traveled for work. In early July of 1965, the Likens parents made a decision that was intended to bring stability to their daughters' lives. They needed a place for Sylvia and Jenny to stay so the girls could attend school regularly while the parents followed the carnival route. Through a casual acquaintance, they were introduced to Gertrude Baniszewski. Gertrude was a 36-year-old mother of 7 who lived in a rented home in a working-class neighborhood of Indianapolis. To Lester and Betty Likens, the arrangement seemed pragmatic. Gertrude was already caring for a large brood of children, and the home, while undeniably impoverished, appeared to be a functioning household. An informal agreement was struck. The Likens parents would pay Gertrude $20 a week to board, feed, and care for Sylvia and Jenny. There were no background checks, no formal contracts, and no state oversight. It was a simple handshake agreement, a product of a more trusting, albeit dangerously unregulated era. At the time of this arrangement, Gertrude Baniszewski was a woman struggling under the immense weight of her own life choices and circumstances. A deep dive into her psychological profile reveals a deeply troubled individual. She had experienced multiple failed marriages, profound financial instability, and deteriorating physical health, including chronic asthma and severe depression. The house on East New York Street was in a state of disrepair, a chaotic environment where resources were scarce and stress was a constant presence. Rather than recognizing her inability to take on the care of 2 additional teenagers, Gertrude accepted the arrangement, likely driven by the desperate need for the $20 weekly stipend. For the first few weeks, the arrangement appeared to function as intended. Sylvia and Jenny attended school, and while the living conditions were far from ideal, they were manageable. However, the delicate equilibrium of the Baniszewski household was soon disrupted. The turning point arrived when a weekly payment from the Likens parents arrived a few days late. This minor administrative delay became the catalyst for a catastrophic shift in Gertrude's behavior. The delayed payment was not merely an inconvenience to Gertrude. In her deteriorating psychological state, it was perceived as a profound insult, a trigger that unleashed a torrent of deep-seated resentments. Gertrude began to project her lifelong frustrations, her poverty, and her anger onto Sylvia. Sylvia, who was known to be a cheerful, polite, and attractive teenager, became the focal point of Gertrude's misplaced rage. The maltreatment began subtly. It started with verbal degradation, the assignment of excessive household chores, and the deliberate restriction of food. In the study of criminal psychology, this escalation is often observed in environments where an authoritarian figure holds absolute control over isolated dependents. Gertrude systematically began to strip away Sylvia's dignity, creating an environment where the teenager was viewed not as a human being deserving of care, but as an object of scorn. What makes this case uniquely complex and deeply unsettling from a sociological perspective is how Gertrude managed to involve others in the systemic abuse. She did not act alone. Gertrude actively encouraged her own children, particularly her eldest daughter Paula and her son John, to participate in the mistreatment. Furthermore, she manipulated the neighborhood children, who frequently visited the house. She created a perverse household dynamic where participating in the torment of Sylvia was rewarded with her approval, while refusing to participate carried the threat of becoming her next target. Psychologists and sociologists have studied this specific aspect of the case for decades. It serves as a harrowing real-world example of authoritative conditioning and groupthink. The neighborhood children, ranging in age from 10 to 15, were impressionable. When an adult authority figure not only sanctions but actively encourages malicious behavior, the moral compass of a child can become severely distorted. The diffusion of responsibility within the group allowed these youths to commit acts they would likely never have considered individually. They rationalized their behavior because everyone else was doing it, and because the adult in charge told them it was acceptable. Sylvia was systematically dehumanized in the eyes of these children, transforming their actions into a normalized routine within the confines of the Baniszewski home. As the weeks turned into months, Sylvia's condition deteriorated rapidly. She was subjected to severe, prolonged physical deprivation and psychological torment. She was isolated from the outside world, eventually forced to reside in the subterranean environment of the home's basement, an area devoid of basic human necessities. The basement became a tool of ultimate isolation, cutting Sylvia off from any potential avenues of rescue. Her sister, Jenny, who suffered from a physical disability due to childhood polio, was forced to witness this systemic destruction, paralyzed by the very real threat that she would suffer the same fate if she attempted to intervene or seek help. This brings us to one of the most agonizing questions surrounding the case. Where was the community? The Baniszewski home was not situated in a remote, rural area. It was in a densely populated neighborhood. The houses were close together. Neighbors later admitted to hearing unusual noises, observing Sylvia's declining physical state on the rare occasions she was seen outside, and noticing the constant influx of neighborhood children. Yet, no one intervened. No one called the authorities. This tragic failure can be attributed to the prevailing social norms of 1965. During that era, the concept of domestic privacy was paramount. What happened inside a family's home was widely considered to be their own business. The cultural mandate to mind one's own business was deeply ingrained. Furthermore, the modern apparatus of child protective services, complete with anonymous hotlines and mandatory reporting laws, did not exist. Teachers, neighbors, and even medical professionals lacked the legal frameworks and educational training to identify and report suspected child maltreatment. The community's inaction was a fatal manifestation of the bystander effect, a psychological phenomenon where individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim when other people are present, assuming someone else will take responsibility. In Sylvia's case, everyone assumed someone else would intervene, and as a result, no one did. The breaking point arrived on October 26, 1965. The Indianapolis Police Department received a call directing them to the residence on East New York Street. Upon arrival, Officer Arthur and his colleagues were met by Gertrude Baniszewski, who presented a calm, albeit fatigued, demeanor. She handed the officers a letter, allegedly written by Sylvia, claiming she had run away with a group of boys who had inflicted severe injuries upon her. Gertrude attempted to construct a narrative that distanced herself entirely from the tragedy, relying on the assumption that the police would accept the word of a mother over any other evidence. However, as the officers conducted their initial walkthrough of the premises, the physical evidence immediately contradicted Gertrude's carefully constructed deception. The officers located Sylvia It was immediately apparent that she had passed away, and the clinical signs of long-term, systemic neglect and severe physical maltreatment were undeniable. The environment itself spoke volumes. The home was squalid, and the basement area revealed a chilling tableau of confinement. The most crucial breakthrough, in those initial moments, came not from forensic evidence, but from an act of immense courage. Jenny Likens, despite the overwhelming trauma and fear she had endured, recognized that this was her only opportunity to speak the truth. As an officer approached her, she whispered a plea for rescue, promising to reveal everything that had transpired if they would just get her out of that house. Jenny's quiet, desperate statement was the catalyst that shattered Gertrude's alibi and initiated one of the most extensive and complex homicide investigations in Indiana's history. The immediate aftermath saw the arrest of Gertrude Baniszewski, her children, and several neighborhood youths. The Indianapolis Police Department was faced with the monumental task of unraveling a conspiracy of silence that involved an adult and multiple minors. The investigation required a meticulous, multidisciplinary approach, relying heavily on the evolving field of forensic pathology and specialized interrogation techniques. The medical examiner's role was pivotal. In the 1960s, forensic pathology was beginning to play a more central role in criminal investigations. The clinical autopsy of Sylvia Likens provided undeniable, scientific proof of the timeline and severity of the abuse. The medical examiner documented extensive evidence of malnutrition, noting the severe depletion of muscle mass and subcutaneous fat. Furthermore, the forensic analysis of scar tissue and various injuries indicated that the maltreatment had been ongoing for months, definitively disproving Gertrude's claim that Sylvia had recently been attacked by strangers. The medical evidence painted a clinical, undeniable picture of a slow, systematic deprivation of life, providing the prosecution with the scientific foundation needed to build their case. Simultaneously, detectives faced the psychological challenge of interrogating the minors involved. Interviewing traumatized and manipulated children requires a delicate balance of empathy and investigative rigor. Investigators had to deconstruct the false narratives that Gertrude had embedded in the minds of these youths. Slowly, through careful questioning and corroboration of statements, the horrifying truth emerged. The children began to confess, detailing the daily routines of the household and the specific instructions they received from Gertrude. They described how the neighborhood had become a closed ecosystem of coercion, where participation in the abuse was the only way to secure the approval of the adult authority figure. The sheer volume of statements, cross-referenced with the medical examiner's findings, created an airtight evidentiary web around Gertrude Baniszewski and the primary instigators. The trial of Gertrude Baniszewski, her daughter Paula, her son John, and neighborhood youths Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs commenced in the spring of 1966. It was a media spectacle that captured the attention of the nation. The Marion County Courthouse was packed daily with reporters and citizens, all struggling to comprehend how such systemic cruelty could occur in their own backyard. The prosecution, led by Deputy Prosecutor Leroy New, faced a unique and formidable challenge. They had to prosecute an adult alongside several minors, ensuring that the jury understood the distinct levels of culpability. Leroy New's strategy was meticulous and unyielding. He sought to prove that Gertrude was the mastermind, the architect of the environment that led to Sylvia's passing, while holding the youths accountable for their direct participation. The prosecution relied heavily on the undeniable medical evidence, presenting the clinical findings in a clear, objective manner that left no room for doubt regarding the cause and nature of the fatal injuries. The defense, led by attorney William Urbecker, faced an almost insurmountable task, given the weight of the evidence. Urbecker's primary strategy for Gertrude was to pursue a defense of insanity. He argued that Gertrude was suffering from severe mental illness, exacerbated by her physical ailments and the stress of poverty, which rendered her incapable of understanding the criminality of her actions. The defense painted a picture of a woman whose mind had completely fractured, suggesting that she had lost contact with reality and could not be held legally responsible for the events that unfolded in her home. The courtroom drama reached its emotional zenith when Jenny Likens took the witness stand. The courtroom fell completely silent as the young girl, still bearing the emotional and physical scars of her ordeal, recounted the months of systemic abuse. Her testimony was powerful, direct, and unshakable. She detailed the psychological manipulation, the isolation of her sister, and the specific actions of the defendants. Jenny's presence humanized the clinical evidence, transforming forensic reports into a deeply personal narrative of suffering and endurance. Following Jenny, the prosecution called upon the neighborhood children to testify. Their testimonies provided a chilling look into the psychology of group violence. The youths recounted their actions with a detached, almost clinical demeanor that shocked the jury. They explained how Gertrude had normalized the behavior, how they felt compelled to participate, and how the moral boundaries of right and wrong had been completely erased within the walls of that house. These testimonies dismantled the defense's argument that Gertrude was merely a passive, mentally ill observer. They proved she was an active, manipulative director of the cruelty. Psychiatric experts were called by both sides to debate Gertrude's mental state. The prosecution's experts argued convincingly that while Gertrude exhibited signs of personality disorders and depression, she was legally sane. They pointed to her attempts to cover up the crime, such as writing the fake runaway letter, as clear evidence of a consciousness of guilt. A person who does not understand the difference between right and wrong, they argued, does not take calculated steps to deceive law enforcement. After weeks of exhausting testimony and presentation of evidence, the case was handed to the jury. The deliberations were intense, as the jury had to navigate the complex legal instructions regarding the different charges for the adult and the minor defendants. Finally, the verdicts were delivered. Gertrude Baniszewski was found guilty of first-degree murder, a landmark conviction that rejected the insanity defense and held her fully accountable for her role as the architect of the tragedy. Her daughter Paula was found guilty of second-degree murder. John Baniszewski, Coy Hubbard, and Richard Hobbs were found guilty of manslaughter. The sentencing phase brought a sense of legal closure to the immediate tragedy. Gertrude was sentenced to life in prison, ensuring she would be removed from society. The minor defendants received varying sentences in juvenile reformatories. However, the legal journey of this case did not end there. The appellate process is a fundamental component of the justice system, designed to ensure that the rights of the accused were fully protected during the trial. In 1971, the Indiana Supreme Court granted Gertrude a retrial, citing prejudicial factors in the original proceedings, specifically the decision to try her alongside the minor defendants, which the court ruled may have unfairly influenced the jury against her. The 1971 retrial was a test of the justice system's endurance. By this time, the public fervor had somewhat subsided, but the prosecution remained steadfast in their pursuit of accountability. Once again, the medical evidence was presented. Once again, the timeline of systemic neglect was established. And once again, a jury found Gertrude Baniszewski guilty, this time of first-degree murder, reaffirming her life sentence. She would eventually be released on parole in 1985, a decision that sparked immense public outrage, but she lived out the remainder of her days in obscurity, her name forever synonymous with one of the most profound failures of parental and community responsibility in American history. The legacy of the Sylvia Likens case extends far beyond the verdicts and the prison sentences. It served as a massive, painful catalyst for societal and legal reform. In the years following the trial, the public consciousness regarding child welfare underwent a seismic shift. The realization that a child could be subjected to such systemic deprivation in a populated neighborhood, with multiple people aware of the situation, highlighted the fatal flaws in the existing legal framework. This case contributed heavily to the momentum that led to the establishment of modern child protective services. It underscored the absolute necessity for mandatory reporting laws. Today, professionals such as teachers, doctors, and social workers are legally obligated to report any suspicion of child maltreatment. Furthermore, the case highlighted the need for anonymous hotlines and community education programs, empowering neighbors and citizens to speak up without fear of reprisal or the stigma of interfering in domestic matters. The legal and social safety nets that exist today to protect vulnerable children were built, in part, upon the tragic lessons learned from the house on East New York Street. In the realm of psychology and sociology, the case remains a heavily studied subject. It is frequently cited in academic discussions regarding the bystander effect, the diffusion of responsibility, and the terrifying power of authoritative conditioning. It serves as a permanent, educational case study for law enforcement and social workers on how to identify the subtle signs of systemic abuse and the importance of cross-referencing witness statements with forensic pathology. But amidst the legal precedents, the psychological studies, and the historical analyses, it is vital to remember the human element at the center of this narrative. Sylvia Likens was not just a case file or a catalyst for legal reform. She was a daughter, a sister, and a young woman with hopes and aspirations. Her sister Jenny, despite the profound trauma she endured, went on to live a quiet life, carrying the memory of her sister with her until her own passing. In recent years, the community of Indianapolis has made concerted efforts to reclaim Sylvia's narrative from the darkness of the tragedy. Memorials have been established, and public dedications have been held to honor her memory. These efforts focus not on the suffering she endured, but on her enduring spirit and the profound impact her brief life had on the world. The house on East New York Street was eventually demolished, erasing the physical monument to the tragedy and replacing it with an empty lot that serves as a quiet space for reflection. The community chose to tear down the structure of her confinement and build up a legacy of awareness and protection. The investigation, the forensic breakthroughs, and the courtroom battles of 1965 and 1966 demonstrated the justice system's ability to uncover the truth and assign accountability, even in the face of widespread deception and communal failure. The medical examiners, the detectives, and the prosecutors worked tirelessly to ensure that the systemic neglect Sylvia suffered was met with the full force of the law. They transformed a chaotic, heartbreaking scene into a structured, clinical presentation of facts that demanded justice. As we examine the historical context, the forensic evidence, and the legal outcomes of this landmark case, we are left to ponder the broader implications for our own communities. The story of Sylvia Likens teaches us that the safety of the most vulnerable among us does not rely solely on the police or the courts. It relies on the vigilance and the courage of the community. It challenges us to look beyond our own front doors and to recognize that the responsibility to protect one another is a collective duty. In an era where we are more connected than ever, yet often profoundly isolated, we must ask ourselves, if we were to hear the quiet cries for help from a neighbor, would we have the courage to step forward, or would we simply turn away and hope someone else intervenes?